Welcome back. I'm James Guzek. Today, my topic is Sabbath feuding in the 4th century church. And in this talk, I'll be considering what Adventist Kenneth Strand misses. Let's begin just with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So this 20-minute talk has two parts. In part one, I'll consider Kenneth Strand's view of Apostolic Constitutions. Constitutions was written in AD 380, and Socrates' Scholasticus, Church History, written in AD 440. In part two, I'll give my understanding of the history of the 3rd and 4th centuries, with an emphasis on a 3rd century Sabbath-keeping movement and a late 4th century Sabbath feuding period between bishops, finishing up with the important dialogue between Jerome and Augustine. Now, some background. In the early times of Seventh-day Adventism, J.N. Andrews pointed out that the 2nd century Christian writings posed serious problems for the Adventist understanding that all early Christians kept the Sabbath. Andrews understood that texts like the Epistle of Barnabas, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian all were incompatible with the idea that Christians were keeping the Sabbath in the 2nd century. All 4 of these authors reject that Christians need to keep the Sabbath or that they were keeping the Sabbath. The problem, and I've explained it a few times here, is that if Paul taught Gentile Christians to keep the Sabbath, all 2nd century Christians should be keeping the Sabbath. So the problem for Adventism is, why are there so many texts which reject that Christians need to keep the Sabbath? Could it be that Paul rejected that his Gentile Christians ought to keep the Sabbath? This is the problem faced by Seventh-day Adventism. In the 1980s, specifically in 1982, Kenneth Strand stepped into this matter and offered something new for Adventism. Strand argues, in short, that in the 2nd century, some Christians jettisoned the Sabbath, specifically only the Christians in Rome and Alexandria alone. Strand holds that outside of Rome and Alexandria, all Christians continued to keep the Sabbath down through the centuries, and admittedly, this explains at least 2 of the contrary 2nd century writings. And Strand also writes that in the 5th century, the Sabbath became, quote-unquote, ossified. Now, obviously, there are some problems with Strand's proposal. There's no explanation of why Tertullian in North Africa, Irenaeus in Gaul, or Origen in Palestine also reject the Sabbath. And Strand does not report any cries of apostasy over the actions of Rome and Alexandria, which he and Adventism see as rank apostasy. Also, Strand relies on latter texts rather than earlier ones. Specifically, as I mentioned, he relies on Apostolic Constitutions, a text written in AD 380. And admittedly, this text, we'll see, teaches Christians to keep the Sabbath. But he also relies on the church history text of Socrates' Scholasticus, written in AD 440. But he doesn't rely and he doesn't cite the earlier church texts from the 2nd century. So all of this is contained in greater detail. I can't go into all the detail, but it's contained in my forthcoming book, A New Look at the Origins of the Liturgical Year. If you like this material, please like and subscribe. Thank you. In prior talks, I've mentioned that Apostolic Constitutions, a text written about AD 380, teaches that Christians ought to keep the Sabbath. Let's look a little more closely at this text. In Book 7, we read, quote, "But keep the Sabbath and the Lord's Day festival." And in Book 2, we read, "You shall observe the Sabbath on account of him who ceased from his work of creation, but ceased not from his work of providence. It is a rest for meditation of the law, not for idleness of hands." So, from this, scholars generally take that Christians are being taught to keep the Sabbath by the author of Apostolic Constitutions. And this implies that many late 4th century Christians were keeping the Sabbath. J.N. Andrews understood this well. He writes, Constitutions shows exclusively that at that period, that is, at the time when Constitutions was written, the observance of the Sabbath according to the commandment was extensive in the Eastern churches. I can agree with that. I can also agree that with Andrews that we are left in the dark regarding the question of whether prior Christians, prior to the late 4th century, kept the Sabbath. So the question that Adventists have sought to answer is, can we trace this teaching of Apostolic Constitutions that Christians ought to keep the Sabbath back into the 3rd century, from the 3rd to the 2nd, from the 2nd century to apostolic times? And this is what the work of Strand claims to do. And he does this based on a reading of another text, a later text even than Apostolic Constitution, the church history text of Socrates' Scholasticus, which was written 60 years after Apostolic Constitutions, that is in AD 440. According to Strand, Socrates teaches that the whole Christian world, excepting Alexandria and Rome, kept the Sabbath right up to AD 440. Now, this proposal seems to have found general acceptance within Adventism, where we find it in the doctrinal Adventist texts Seventh-day Adventists believe, a biblical exposition of 27 fundamental doctrines. To be perfectly clear, Strand's proposal that Christians in early Rome and Alexandria alone set aside the Sabbath rests not on documents from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but on documents from the 4th and 5th centuries, specifically Apostolic Constitutions and the church history text of Socrates' Scholasticus. So when I speak of Strand's proposal, it's fair to say that this is the same proposal found in Seventh-day Adventist belief. So whether I refer to Strand's proposal or the proposal of Seventh-day Adventist belief, for my purposes in this lecture today, they're the same. Now, the text Seventh-day Adventists believe explains, quote, from the 2nd to the 5th centuries, while Sunday was rising in influence, Christians continued to observe the seventh-day Sabbath nearly everywhere throughout the Roman Empire. The 5th century historian Socrates' Scholasticus wrote, almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week, yet the Christians of Alexandria and at Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this. This proposal begins with a pretty bold claim. While Sunday was rising in influence, Christians continued to observe the seventh-day Sabbath nearly everywhere. Well, as we understood, he's claiming that they continued to be observed everywhere except in the cities of Rome and Alexandria. Well, how do Strand and the authors of Seventh-day Adventists believe no? Well, this text explained. This text, Seventh-day Adventists believe, just explained it. They find it in the argument of Socrates' Scholasticus. So let's look at what Socrates' Scholasticus is teaching. Is he teaching all about early church history about the Sabbath, that all Christians throughout the early centuries kept the Sabbath? Let's look. Socrates writes, quote, almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week. They celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week. Yet the Christians of Alexandria and at Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this. They've ceased to celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week in Alexandria and Rome. There's a key term here. What is the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath? Well, Strand teaches that the sacred mysteries is the Lord's Supper, but then on the other hand, he teaches that the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath is closely connected or equivalent with Sabbath keeping. Exactly how it's connected with Sabbath keeping, neither Strand nor the doctrinal text Seventh-day Adventists believe explain. Even more curious, 5 years before Strand wrote, Samuel Bacchiocchi had also studied this text of Socrates. And neither Strand nor the doctrinal text Seventh-day Adventists believe comment on Bacchiocchi's reading. In 1977, Bacchiocchi had written, quote, according to Socrates' Scholasticus, in Rome and Alexandria, There were no Eucharistic celebrations on the Sabbath, unquote. And by that, Bacchiocchi means there were no Saturday Eucharistic celebrations in Rome and Alexandria. And Bacchiocchi rightly attributes this to an action of Pope Innocent, who had written in about AD 401, enjoining a weekly Saturday fast or a weekly Sabbath fast. And on the basis of that, then 40 years later, there were no Eucharistic celebrations in Rome or Alexandria. So how did Bacchiocchi know that Socrates is speaking about the Saturday Eucharist when Strand and Seventh-day Adventists believe doesn't? 5 points. Number one, the term Sabbath in the early church was colloquial in many circles for the day we now call Saturday. We see this from A.C. Calivus, an Orthodox scholar who explains that the calendars of ancient times assigned numbers to the days of the week. Even in the Bible, we hear on the first day of the week, Jesus was raised from the dead. Second day of the week is Tuesday. Third day of the week is Wednesday. But the ecclesial as well as the civil calendars, Calivus explains, in the first centuries often used, instead of the word seventh day, they would use the term Sabbath. Now that's not to say that the Romans kept the Sabbath. Hardly. Rather, they just found it a nice term to use Sabbath instead of seventh day, although they had no religious connotation to that. Number two, the sacred mysteries. Socrates did not invent the term sacred mysteries, meaning the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. It's used in 110 by Ignatius of Antioch, by Origen in 230, by Eusebius, and by Epiphanius. And Adventists and Catholics alike understand that based on these comparative texts, the words sacred mysteries refers to the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. Number three, the letter of Pope Innocent to Dissentius. As I just mentioned, about AD 401, Pope Innocent promoted a weekly Sabbath fast. And that surely came with a discontinuation of the Saturday Eucharist. And this resulted, 40 years later, Socrates sees before him that in the cities of Alexandria and Rome, they don't celebrate the Eucharist on Saturdays. So there was no celebration of the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath. Fourth, Augustine in 401 and Cassian about 420 both mention that the weekly Saturday fast hardly extended beyond Rome. And five, there's the ancient tradition. Now, if you recall, Socrates says that in Alexandria and Rome, they don't celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath according to some ancient tradition. He doesn't know what that tradition is. Well, in Innocent's letter, we find out what that tradition was. Innocent in 401 appeals to the ancient tradition of the Good Friday and Holy Saturday fast. And on the basis of this 2-day Paschal fast, he asks for a weekly Friday and Saturday fast. So Bacchiocchi is surely correct when Socrates is saying that in Alexandria and Rome, Christians did not celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath days or Saturdays. Socrates means to teach that the churches of Alexandria and Rome did not have Saturday Eucharistic celebrations in AD 440, something of an oddity. So it should be obvious that Socrates is speaking about the Saturday Eucharist, and that Strand and the authors of Seventh-day Adventist believe have given the text of Socrates a meaning that Socrates never intended. So where does this leave us with regards to Strand's proposal? Well, at least we can say Socrates doesn't say anything about the Sabbath. But Apostolic Constitutions certainly teaches that many late 4th century Christians in Asia Minor were keeping the Sabbath. That brings us to part 2, the Sabbath in the 3rd and 4th centuries. To understand what's happening in the 3rd and 4th centuries, we have to go back to the mid-2nd century. We know in apostolic times, the And even up to the early second century, Jewish believers in Jesus continued to see a role for keeping the law and all the Sabbaths. Then in AD 132 to 135, there was the Second Jerusalem Revolt. And when the revolt was put down, the Romans persecuted the Jews for decades. And even at this time, Christians, Justin Martyr relates, started thinking that, well, if Jewish believers would yet keep the law and Sabbaths, could they be considered even saved? Justin thinks that they can be considered saved, but not everybody did. In short, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, there was persecution of the Jews on all sides, which caused Jewish Christians to at least give up the public keeping of the law. And persecution continued for more than 60 years. Robert L. Wilkin explains in his text, John Chrysostom and the Jews. So Jewish persecution ceased about AD 200 to 210, and we can suspect that when they were no longer persecuted for keeping the law, Jewish Christians again began, some of them, to publicly keep the law. But I believe there's evidence to show that some now began to specifically evangelize Gentiles with regard specifically to the seventh-day Sabbath, hoping probably to get them to keep the whole law. This begins what I call a Sabbath-keeping movement or a Sabbatizing movement in the 3rd century church. We see this especially in two places. First, Pope Callistus in AD 220 decreed that on Saturdays, 3 times a year, there should be a fast. This is from the Liber Pontificalis, the Book of the Popes. Callistus cites an Old Testament prophecy found in the book of Zechariah 8:19. And Zechariah speaks of a quarterly fast. Now, at the time, there was already a Paschal Sabbath fast, so Zechariah implements 3 more fasts, and he puts them all on Saturdays. The Paschal Sabbath fast was already on Saturday. But the other 3 turned, Callistus enjoins 4 Sabbath fasts in a year. Now, why would Callistus, who reigned as Pope around AD 220, enjoin not a quarterly fast, but a quarterly Sabbath fast? Hold that thought in mind. The second text is the Didascalia Apostolorum, written in the mid-3rd century. The Didascalia writes, quote, "For this reason, be silent, dear brothers, who have come to faith from among the Jewish people, and who still wish to be bound with the bonds of the Mosaic law, and who insist that the Sabbath is prior to the first day of the week." This text pleads with Jewish Christians to be silent about teaching the Sabbath, which indicates that Jewish believers should have been promoting the Sabbath to the Gentiles, surely with some success. So in the 3rd century, between 220 and 250, we have Pope Callistus and the Didascalia disparaging Christians from keeping the Sabbath. And that suggests to me that a Sabbath-keeping movement was afoot. Matters escalate in the late 4th century into what I can see is a Sabbath feud. This is apparent in 2 texts. The first is a text found in AD 367 from the Canon 29 of the Synod of Laodicea. Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day. Christians must work on the Sabbath day, rather honoring the Lord's day, and if they can, resting then on the Lord's day as Christians. Now, such a text that where 32 bishops order Christians that they have to work on the Sabbath is over the top. It indicates that these bishops in Asia Minor have been provoked. Well, who provoked them? A likely candidate is Apostolic Constitutions, which we read Book 2 and Book 7, enjoins a Sabbath keeping upon Christians. So on the one hand, you have groups of Christians who are keeping the Sabbath, and the bishop who writes Apostolic Constitutions is their champion, and he says Christians ought to rest on the Sabbath. And you have 32 bishops in the Synod of Laodicea that step up and say Christians must work on the Sabbath. So this is a Sabbath feud among bishops and even among the laity. So how did this ever get resolved? Well, there are two texts that are important. The first we've already covered is the letter of Innocent I to Dissentius, which Innocent in AD 401 enjoins a weekly Sabbath fast. But we've seen from Socrates that this weekly Sabbath fast was a dud. Nobody observed it except the people in Rome and Alexandria, so it had almost no effect. More important was a dialogue of Jerome and Augustine and an exchange of letters between 394 and 404 AD. And finally, in AD 404, Jerome and Augustine agree that when converts from Judaism, when Jews would convert to Christianity, that they would henceforth no longer be allowed to keep the law or Sabbaths. And with this agreement, this then drained the swamp, because it was Jewish Christians and their keeping of the law and Sabbaths that was at the root of the whole Judaizing, Sabbatizing movement. And certainly Gentile Christians who were Sabbatizing or keeping the Sabbath, like the author of Constitutions, surely got the idea. So to sum up, in the early 3rd century, as persecution of the Jews by imperial Rome ceased, a Sabbath-keeping movement began in the church. This escalated in the late 4th century with 32 bishops at the Synod of Laodicea ordering that Christians must work on the Sabbath, and with Apostolic Constitutions coming back 13 years later in AD 380, teaching the opposite, teaching that Christians ought to rest on the Sabbath. The solution came in two forms from Pope Innocent's weekly Sabbath fast, but more so when Jerome and Augustine agreed that converts from Judaism ought no longer to be allowed to keep their ancestral practices. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.